So the lecture today is on React, and we're going to keep live coding the project that we started last week. And the purpose of today is in particular to take what we've done already and refactor it a little bit into what are React best practices. Because currently we've got some things that are a little wonky about our structure. So who's been present for all the lectures? Okay. So we'll just catch you up briefly. So the project is the CRUD Mutably project, which I think we're all pretty familiar with, or at least becoming familiar with. So the idea is build this interface that has these interactive qualities where you can access this data store that's on a server and pull information, push information. And so up until now, we've been doing that in vanilla.js or jQuery, and now we're doing it in React. And so the project is relatively straightforward. We've used Create React App to create the scaffolding for us. And I, in general, really recommend doing that. You know, there's some value to learning how to put together a Webpack config and all of that. But the value of Create React App is that it gets you like going right away. So really, really do recommend that. React projects typically have a source folder, and in that source folder they have like an app.js would be a kind of common entry point. And in this project right now, we've got actually two components. There's the app component itself, which starts here, and the app component is the container for the whole project. And it's responsible for rendering really the entire interface that we're working with. It's got some state that we're managing, and as we update that state, React knows to update the interface accordingly. It'll re-render the interface. This component makes use of this other component that we made called an editable row. So on the page, we've got these rows of information, and every one has the same property where it's going to display some information, should have an edit button. When you click the edit button, it should allow you to edit the information. There should be a save button. Once you hit save, it should take an action. So we decided to make it a component. And so this component has its own state, whether or not it's editable. And right now we've got the title and the author. And we've got these two handlers. So toggle editable is when we click that button, what do we do? And currently when we click the button, we check to see if we're currently editable. That means it's time to save. So we make this fetch request and put, excuse me, put the data back on the server. If not, we just set the state to editable equal true. And then this handle input we use because input itself is state in React. So the contents of a text box represents state in the app. And so every time somebody types something into the text box, you want to update the state so that you can re-render that text box with whatever they typed. Cool. So you may be getting the sense as you look at this that this is a lot of code for one file, and that the components could maybe use a little bit of tweaking. Yeah, there's just kind of a lot going on in here. One of the distinctions that's useful that you should take as a kind of guide, but not as a hard and fast rule, is that a lot of times in React you'll have container components and presentational components. And that in general, what that means is that a container component handles the logic of something and the kind of management of something, and the presentational components are meant to be very simple. They're not meant to have a lot of logic in them. They're just meant to render something, display something, and you're putting them in a component so that you can reuse them. So in this case, app would be a container component, and editable row would be the presentational component. Any thoughts or questions on getting caught up?
I think it makes sense so far.
Good. In every React component, probably the thing your eyes will go to first is the render function. So this is the render function of the app component. And this is where the kind of rubber meets the road, where it's actually rendering what it is that you see. And so you can take a look here and see this is actually basically copied and pasted from the CRUD Mutably project originally. So it's just HTML. This is the JSX syntax. Everybody's seen this before, where you have XML in a JavaScript file. And the thing to know about the JSX is that it can seem kind of magical. It's actually not magic. What happens is when it's time to execute this JavaScript code, it's run through Bable, transpiler, and every time you see something like this, it's just turned into react.createElement div, and I forget exactly the syntax, but it's got some arguments, and these are the children here. So it's a convenience. It's a way to make working with XML or HTML markup easier, and I think there are a lot of gains to doing that. But it's good to know that under the hood, there's really no magic happening. It's just taking whatever you see here, and each XML element here is actually just being turned into this call to a function, create element. So there are a couple of things that I notice about this right away that I'd want to refactor. And probably the first one that is kind of a code smell is in this editable row component. So up here, editable row. So again, we want this component to encapsulate this basic functionality and be as reusable as possible. And one of the things that stands out to me immediately is that we have some code in here right now that actually has the address of a particular app, and it makes this fetch call within the editable row. The very common pattern in React is to move actions up so that the actual handler of an event doesn't happen in the presentational component. It's passed down to the presentational component through props as a function, like a callback function, basically. And so this would be a perfect example of something to lift up to the higher order component, so that the app component can handle the fetch logic, and this editable row can just handle the, what an editable row does. So in order to do that, I'm going to take basically this. Yeah, so just this call to fetch. I'm going to pop this out here. And we're going to go down here. So this is the app component. And I'm going to write a function. And this is going to be I might come up with a better name, but this will be UpdateRow. Okay. And it looks a little bit better. And this note here is actually just describing what we're talking about, actually. So we want to write a function that takes in some data and calls this fetch. So we know that first we need an ID. We've called it book ID right here. And then we also see that we need title, author, and image URL. So we could take in all of those as arguments, but I'm actually inclined to just take in a book argument that will be an object that contains each of these keys. And it makes this potentially a little more flexible if we were at some point to make this universal for books, Pokemon, albums, whatever the case may be. So we're going to take in a book, and we can destructure from that book the, I think it's underscore ID, title, author, image, URL. I think that's what those actual keys are, but let me double check. So this is the actual API, and yeah, underscore ID, title, author, and just image. Cool. So we, why is this giving me warnings? That doesn't look very good. Okay, hopefully that didn't break anything. I just did a, I ran Prettier, which is the formatter that's based on your ESLint file. And what did that do? Yeah, okay, that's that's fine. So good. So we want to take this fetch and take underscore ID, and then here it's just going to be title, author, and image. Cool. And then we've got this console log on here just for good measure. And I suppose we can just return this promise that comes back from fetch in case we want to handle it or see if it was successful or if it failed. So we've got this update row function now. And what we want to do now is pass this down to the editable row. So if we go down here, you can see that here we've got our array of books and we're mapping over it. And this is a pretty common pattern in React, is that you take an array of some data, you map over it, and the thing that you return out of the map is the actual React component. And so that syntax here, so we're taking in a book and then we're returning, wrapped in parentheses, this HTML. And so let's pass down the HandleSave function. So we're going to pass in this dot, what do we call it? Update row. And of course, we're not calling it here. We're passing the function. You may see that there's something else that we have to do here, because we're passing a function that is going to get called now in a different context. So this update row is going to get called in the context of the editable row. And the problem is that, well, actually there may not be a problem with this. Oftentimes when you're writing functions like this, you'll be referencing something in this component. So if we had like a, get ID equals this dot props dot ID. If we had something like this, this would pertain to the editable row if we passed it down into that component, which is not what we want, right? Almost, 99% of the time when we're writing a function like this, we want this to pertain to the app component. And so if that were the case, and I'm going to do this just for good measure, you'd want to bind this function. So this dot, what's it called? Update row equals this dot update row dot bind this. And that tells that function, always use this as the context, meaning app, the app instance. We don't actually need to do that because we're not calling this anywhere in here. I'm going to leave it just for now, and we can play around with that later if for some reason we do add something in there. So HandleSave. So now we're passing down a prop, HandleSave. And so we want to do something with it here, which is when we go to toggle editable, if this.state.editable, so if the row is currently editable, we want to set the state to not editable, and then we want to do this handle save. So we call this, I'll actually destructure it up here, so const, and then handle save. So we're destructuring that from our props. And we're going to call it here, handle save, and pass it an object that is got, now what are we passing again? It's underscore ID title author image. So underscore ID equals book ID. Title we get from state, so we can get that up here, const title and author. Those are managed in state because they change, and when they change, when they've changed and it's time to update, we need to pull them from state. So we destructure them here, and title becomes title, and that actually can just be title, like that. You guys know about that? That in ES6, you can, instead of doing title, which oftentimes you end up doing something like this, the syntactic sugar, as they call it, is to just shorten this to title. And that JavaScript knows to expand that to title:title. If the property name in the object that you're creating and the value or the variable are the same name, that's when it'll work. In this case, it won't work because we've got an ID here, but it's currently named book ID in this function. So title, author, and then image, and I think here we're getting that from props as image URL. So image URL.
Anything else? Question?
Yeah.
Why are we getting it as props as image URL versus just image?
Poor naming.
Okay.
I think the, I actually think image URL is a little more descriptive. So when we were creating this component, we wanted to specify it's not an actual image being passed, which couldn't really do anyway, but it's the image URL. Might be a thing I'd go back and refactor, but for right now, I don't feel particularly strongly about it. Do you feel particularly strongly about it?
I just had it as image already, so I just wanted to make sure there wasn't like some naming convention thing that would cause like a issue.
Yeah, there isn't as far as I know. Yeah. So we want to handle save, and then we want to return out of this function, out of the toggle editable. So let's go ahead and start up the server and see if our refactoring has worked. We've got any bugs in here. You'll notice these linting errors. Book ID, I don't know if you can see that. Book ID is missing in props validation. So this is something that the Airbnb style guide recommends, and I generally think is a good idea, which is to do for every component that you have, there's something called prop types, where you basically specify in advance what the props are that that component needs to successfully work. So for this component, it would be this.props.title, author. We need, I mean, it's basically everything that we're passing down here. Title, author, image URL, book ID, and HandleSave. And so,
oh, sorry, I was about to say, and I've seen in some like tutorials I've done that you can say like, and I want this to always be a string, and I want this to always be an array. Is that something that's commonly done? Or?
It is. And the two things that it'll get you, two important things that it'll get you, one is just documentation. In React, there's not a super clear other place that you can just look right away to see what props a component needs. And so doing the prop types will help with that. It also will tell you at runtime if the component is being rendered without one of those props. And so that is occasionally useful. The syntax, React, prop, types. So prop types is a separate library, used to be included with the React project, and they've kind of trimmed that down. And so it looks like something like this. So you want the prop types to be static, statically defined. So you define it out here rather than as a instance method. So out here it would be editable row.prop types equals, and then we got just an object. And so we would say title, author, HandleSave, what are the other ones? Book ID. And an image URL. And then you define what they actually are. So if we had imported the prop types package, we would do prop types string. No, this is a number. Where is that? Yeah, just prop types.number. And then you can do is required, which almost always it's going to be required unless you have some sort of default value. Title would be prop types dot string dot is. You get the idea. And the interesting ones are when you have so function would be prop types dot func is required. The interesting one is when you have an object. So if you were saying like our object, you'd call that a shape. Prop types dot shape. I wonder if they have an example here. Yeah, shape. So shape just refers to an object, and then inside that you can specify the particular properties, or you can just leave it, I think, as prop types dot shape if you want. So now, since we've done all of this, why don't we just add in this library. Whew. I'm playing around with this Better Touch tool, and it's a really useful utility, except that sometimes it just kind of like jitters, and all of a sudden a screen will become like full size. So yarn add prop types. And then we'll import it up here. Import prop types from prop types. And so author needs to be prop types dot string dot is required. You can see how this is like very self-documenting. Like even the syntax, even the syntax of prop types, it's like it reads like almost like a sentence. Like book ID is a prop that's a number and it's required. Prop types, string is required. Okay. So hopefully we haven't broken anything.
I have a question for you. In this session, are we going to refactor and pull out the components into separate files?
Yep. We'll do that.
Started doing that. I just wanted to make sure that I'm like following along.
Yeah, we can do that next. Yeah, it's generally a no-no to put multiple components in one file. It's just confusing, and it's much easier to read if you can open a file and you can just see one component. Sometimes when I'm live coding, it's a little bit easier to write everything that you need as you go and then refactor it later. Cool. So let's start up the server and just see what we got. Yarn start. Yarn start runs a React script that starts up a web server with hot reloading, and it runs Bable and Webpack. So it does all of those things for you under the hood, which is quite nice. And it means that if we change something about the file, say we say we're really enthusiastic about the title, it'll automatically refresh. Cool, so it looks like it's working, so let's just double check. And, you know, we're gonna change this to Juliet and Romeo. Hit save, and now let's refresh this page just to see if when we refetch the data from the server, if it's giving us what we want, and yes, in fact it is. Cool. So let's pull this out into a different file. You'll see sometimes in React projects, like in the source folder, there'll be like container components, and then there'll be something just called components sometimes. I don't love that way of structuring the project. Like I don't know. It's sometimes a little bit harder to, like, you have to do this like mental calculation, like, okay, so this component is that kind of component, so I'm going to find it in there and whatever. I think there are probably other ways to structure a React project that are a little more intuitive, but there's also no one right way. Particularly if you're using something for state management other than the React component itself. So if you're using Redux or MobX, there are some kind of best practice prescribed ways to structure folders there, and that happens once you get once you add that in. Yeah.
We've been taught, or at least Puneet's been telling us to do like an atoms molecule pages for our folder structure.
Say it again.
What Puneet's taught when we do React is that we do atoms molecules pages as like a way to divide your components into like the most basic, the like middle, and then like the larger container. That way you can just like keep track of like where they go as you're building them out.
Yeah, so atoms, molecules, and pages. Yeah, it's interesting because that does like immediately conjure, like it's a little bit easier to think like, oh, this would be an atom and this would be a molecule. I think like ultimately that may be more of a like instructional context type pattern. I haven't seen that a lot other places, but again, I absolutely encourage you to use a naming scheme. Like, just be thoughtful about it. Use a naming scheme that makes sense to you and that you predict other developers when they look at your code will get right away. So we've got an app.js. Let's make a editable row.js. So we're going to go up here, copy all of this. And then we're going to just get rid of except I want to leave these questions. There's a React developer named Michael Jackson who I just thought it was really insightful that he pointed out that answering these two questions, like if you're ever stuck creating a React component or architecting your app, answering these two questions oftentimes tells you what you need to do next. So what state does my app have, and when does it change? Because those are really the things that you're defining about a React component. So this is just, so we can comment this out for now, unless we want to add prop types to this, which I don't know that it would really have anything. We're not getting anything from props here. And so now an editable row, can get rid of this. This line was to disable ESLint from yelling at me for having two components in one file. So now we don't have to worry about that. And then in app.js, we will import editable row from editable row, which is a file here. Same folder. So I'm going to keep things in this same folder right now because when you have three components, there's no reason to break them out into separate things. And here we want to export default class. So I wrote quite a bit of React before coming to Learners Guild, and then diving into the node world where we were doing a lot of const something equals require or whatever. I just really missed the syntax, because to then go at the end of the file and have module.exports equals, and then you're writing everything over again, the function names, it just makes a lot more sense to me, is my personal taste, to when you're declaring the component or the function or the you can do this for a variable too, export const x equals 5, that you can do it just in line in the moment. Yeah.
So if you're having multiple things that you're exporting within a single file, does that still work, or do you have to do the modules export?
It does work, and it actually, to me, makes a little bit more sense how you do it. So if we were doing this exactly like we have, so we have a default class editable row that we're exporting, we would define this as default, and we could have these other things that we're exporting too, like export, I'm not immediately thinking of a use case when you're defining a React component where you'd want to be exporting a bunch of different things, but I'm sure there is. So then when we import it here, if you just do import whatever the name, and this doesn't actually have to be editable row, it could be, I like bananas, because you're renaming it when you're importing it. This will be the default import. And then if you want to get the other things, you destructure them.
Okay.
So you get X and Y.
So like how React and component things. Okay.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, and under the hood, this is just React.component is how it is in the library.
So would you ever have multiple components? Like they should always be separate in just separate files.
It's the kind of thing it's like never say never. I could imagine a case where you're exporting multiple components, and that was the most ideal choice.
Sure, like maybe you had similar buttons or something.
Yeah, it does make me think, if you're exporting multiple of the same thing from one file, is there a way to just make it the same thing, one component, and then give it some props? Yeah.
Is the adding the default to just simply so you can name it anything you want in the file you're importing?
As best as I know, it's so that when you, so as best as I understand, what this is actually doing is it's like saying module.exports equals editable row, and then module.exports.x equals x, and module exports y equals y. So the default import, what it means is you import it in this particular way where you're saying, make this variable name this thing. And then, and so that's just what it's doing, because a lot of the time you're importing one thing from a file, but then it does give you this other syntax to be able to import other things cleanly. Does that answer your question?
I guess maybe I'll rephrase and say, why would you import something under a different name than you export?
So if you already had something in your app that was named that, or you wanted to clarify if you had two libraries that were named a closely, similar thing, you could change it. So if you wanted to take something that maybe had a long name and simplify it, the truth is, most of the time when you're importing something from, like when we're importing from React, we don't actually know what the default export is named in the file, because again, it doesn't matter for the outside world. It would matter if it was one of these, because you're destructuring this off the
The times that I use that where I name something different is if I have like multiple queries that I've, let's say I have queries from different database files, and I want to bring like two queries from two different files in. Sometimes I'll just give them like quick names like user and books or something like that, instead of having it be like user database or user queries or something. So that might be a way to use it.
Yeah, and you can think about like import PG promise from PG promise. Like you could do, well, you couldn't do that, import PG promise. But a lot of times we end up just doing PGP. So, that would be a context too. Good, so we've moved this into its own file. We don't need this. So now this should still be working. Yep. Yeah.
I got a question about pulling out the fetch call. Because we took it out of the editable row component. What was the reasoning behind that?
When you think about the app that we currently have, and we've got two components, one is an app and one is an editable row, which one to you would it make more sense to have hold the fetching logic?
Oh, it would be the app, but you're not calling multiple times. Got it.
Because you're not, say it again?
Calling, so you don't have to call the fetch every time that you do a for each for the element.
Well, you wouldn't be calling, so to fetch the books in the first place, it would be pretty wonky to try to make that call happen in the editable row. You're absolutely right. So it does make sense to make that fetch in a parent component. You get a list of things, and then you render a set of editable rows. And then, for the save logic, the update logic, the remove logic, the or delete logic, and the CRUD, create logic. For all of that, part of it is just to keep all of that logic in one place. But another part of it is like, you might decide at some point, you might have another project that you're working on where you need an editable row, or maybe it's in the same project, you're rendering something else, and you want that component to be generalized enough that you could just import it into a different thing and have an editable row there. And so in general, I just think about it like when I think of the idea of an editable row that has the functionality of like I click and it's editable and I save and whatever, but what you actually do when you save, that component doesn't need to know about that. So that's why I would pull that out, pull that up. So yeah, so let's look at this. I don't actually love the toggle editable function. If it were me, and it is me right now, I would actually, and I'm actually just going to do this. I'm going to make one that's called handle save click. So this handles when we need to save something. And we don't actually have to check if the state is editable because that's already taken care of. We don't have to return because we return implicitly. And then say handle edit click. And that just does this logic. Oh, did I say earlier that? No, I was talking about something else. So these two handlers now, handle save click and handle edit click, because they both use this. Who knows what we need to do? We've defined new functions, new methods.
We have to bind them at the top.
Yes, we have to bind them. So up here we've got toggle editable. We don't use that anymore, but we can do this dot handle edit click equals this dot handle edit click dot bind this. Same thing for the other one, handle save this dot handle save click bind this. Cool. And then what we want to do is this button. Yeah, so we've got two different buttons. So on the save one, we want to do this dot handle save click. You can see how it's a little more explicit what's happening. Toggle editable is a little bit confusing what it might actually be doing. Handle save click is very clear. In this case, handle edit click. So make sure you didn't break anything. Looks good. Cool. So obviously we could do some styling. This is pretty bad. But sticking with React for a minute. So you can see that this component, editable row, is now really just focused on being an editable row. It takes in some stuff. We could actually even generalize this, like the title and the author. We could find a way to just take in, an array of values to render or something like that. I don't want to do that right now, but it handles a click, and when that click is handled, it just calls this handle save function. It doesn't have to worry about what that function does. Handle edit, handle input. Again, this is when you're actually typing in the text field. And then it just renders something. It renders a row that is either editable or not editable. And you can see this ternary operator here. It's a big ternary operator. Who knows why we need a ternary operator, the ternary if, rather than an if statement?
We don't need it. It's just pretty good, isn't it? Like it's more intuitive when you look at it.
That would be one. That could be one reason. Say we wanted to use an if statement. Why might we not be able to do that right here?
I was wondering that because I tried to do it that way initially and I got errors thrown, and I switched to ternary and it worked. guessing it's something having to do with reserved words or how the JSX gets compiled.
It's closer to the second, how the JSX gets compiled. Because we know that when we open a bracket here in JSX, it gets us back to JavaScript land, and you can put JavaScript things in there. But what specifically can you put in there? The key is to look at line 51 here. All of this is happening in a return statement. And you guys know the difference between a statement and a, oh Lord, I'm gonna forget it now. Expression in JavaScript. So a statement is something that, you know, there's a lot of different ways to talk about this, but it's like something that happens on a line and ends with a semicolon, right? Where if it was an if statement, it would look like this. If true, then whatever, do something. So this is another kind of statement. But an expression is something that can be nested. I'm trying to think if there's like a better way to describe this. But like you couldn't, so if you think about it, you couldn't do this. You know, and one of the reasons why is it's not clear what you're actually returning. Const x equals 5, const y equals 3. It's like, what does that actually mean? That's why return is a statement and if is a statement. But you could do, you know, true, question mark, howdy, otherwise, sad face. Right? Because this is an expression. And so JavaScript can evaluate this on its own, and it becomes just, you know, when JavaScript evaluates this, this would just become howdy. And then return can handle howdy. Make sense? So that's what's happening in the in this render function. You're returning the component, and it's easy to sometimes to forget that you're in a return statement. But all of this, from start to finish, is one big return statement. And I'm trying to think of, this might be interesting, Bable, JavaScript. Bable on its site has got a like instant translator, which is kind of interesting. Where is it? So if we do, I wonder if it's going to let us do this. Yeah, so this is what it translates to, and editable row, create class. Where is our return? Okay, so yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier. This is what all that JSX turns into. Is React.create element div null, I think, is the attributes, and then these are the children of it. And so here you can see that this ternary works. You know, if editable, return this call to React create element. Otherwise, return this call to React create element. Make sense? Just a bunch of nested function calls. Going back to app.js, one of the things that I realized after we did our first coding thing, so there's this linting error, do not use set state in componented mount. And the reason is because this, like whatever happens here, this initial state, this happens immediately thereafter. And so there's no reason to like have it be one thing and then immediately set it to another. And I think there's some sort of like double rendering thing that would happen if that was the case. So we can actually just, because every time this component mounts, it's going to be immediately fetching. We can actually just set the initial state to be true, and that'll prevent that problem. This is getting much closer to what we would want. We could take last few minutes and do one of the other CRUD. So we could do a create. Well, if we were, okay, we can do delete. If we were going to do create, what would we need to do, like high level?
Like a fetch call within the app, so that we could post it to our database.
Yep, we would need a fetch call in the app component.
We need to render a form,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
possibly a component.
Yeah.
For that.
Yeah. So we might create a new component. What would we call it?
Form.
Form.
Create book.
A new book form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. New element form, or whatever we would call it. Yeah. One last thing I want to refactor here is to actually pull this fetch call out of component to mount to be fetch all. I don't want to put book in the title.
Elements.
Yeah. And then we can call this dot fetch all elements. So it keeps a parallel pattern. We've got this fetch call in here. We've got this fetch call in here. Cool. So the delete. You want to walk us through it, Hannah? No. Okay. So what do we need? Well, we obviously need a thing in the user interface to click. So we could add, right now, we could just do, let's see, right down here, because this could happen when we're editable or not, we could do a button, give it a class name. Who remembers what the Bootstrap color is? The button.
It's like caution or something.
Caution. Yeah.
Danger, yeah, something like that.
Bootstrap button class. Warning. Let's do danger. Danger. Always good to make things in your user interface self-evident. And then we'll have an on-click handler for this, and we'll call this dot handle delete, which we can get from, well, let's see, this dot props dot handle delete. And almost always to keep the actual component, like what we're returning, clear, I'll almost always destructure that from props. So handle delete, we'll get up here. And that's part of the like self-documenting thing here that's nice, is that you read this render function and you can see immediately what we're needing from props and from state and where each one is coming from. So this can just be handle delete. And then delete button, not bug. Okay. So we should have a button now. Really need to style this. So now we need to pass down a prop that is the handle delete function. We call it this dot delete row. refactor this. Update element. And then this we'll call delete element. So update element. So delete element. And so here, so I just want to highlight there are kind of two ways to do this. We could have delete, we could have the editable row call delete element with the ID of the thing to delete. And that might be the best way to do it. But we could also here pass a function that, arrow function that we define that just calls this dot delete element with book dot underscore ID. And we would need to bind this. I think you would be able to do it like that. Why would we want to do this? Why might this be an more optimal option?
Is it because you're just grabbing it from the props that are there as opposed to having to like pull it out of the DOM, like pull the book ID out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in this way, when we're doing update element, we're actually passing a book ID to the component. And then when the component calls the function, it's just calling it with the thing that it was already given. With this, we're pulling out some of, like, the editable row doesn't need to know what this function takes. And that's I think, a plus. So the less that the editable row needs to know about specifically what it's rendering, how to call these functions, generally the better. I've been reading that there are some performance implications to doing this, because every time this element renders, it's creating a new function. I've also heard that that's actually not that big of a deal. There's an interesting article that I'll post when I post the video for this that you can read about that. So if we did that, let's just keep it uniform for right now. So just this dot delete element. And this dot delete element. Find this. And we can finish this and just, we can split here. So this function calls fetch, and I don't know why on earth I haven't pulled this out to something. Const base URL. Now, whether you put this out here or whether you put it in the actual component, like as a property of the component, up to you. I don't feel super strongly about it. But then we can replace this with base URL. This. Is this really right? Fetch. That doesn't look right. How is that working?
You're missing your
Yeah.
maybe it never was working. Never checked it.
Oh, maybe is that where I just deleted it from? Yeah, okay, that's where I just deleted it from. It's like, wait a minute. Base URL.
It's so great and also nerve-wracking.
Okay.
Like, I just want to be over. Yeah.
So I'm actually realizing I have a lunch date that I need to get to. But you get the idea. This would be a call to to fetch that just deletes that particular route with the ID. More here. Pretty good.
I'm going to go back and listen to your earlier lectures. Do you kind of, like, I'm hazy on this, and so I'm just wondering if you kind of cover this in a previous lecture or in a totally separate lecture that I can watch?
There's a lot of stuff on the internet about this that might be more like concise.
Yeah. Yeah.
Examples.
Yeah, I'd poke around for like JavaScript, this understanding Java, and if you still have questions, let me know. Cool. Thanks,
I'll
guys.
post some stuff in the channel.
Thank you.